watching Shalom TV, celebrating Jewish culture. Funding for Shalom TV has been provided by the following. And by viewers like you.
For a long time, I have felt that Israel has not gotten its side of the story out when it comes to future of peace negotiations. In fact, there's this gross asymmetry between the way people understand the claims and requirements of the Palestinian side and the requirements of Israel. I used to say when I would lecture many times or in the English-speaking world, you know, if you wake up Saeb Erekat at 1 in the morning, I won't say 3 in the morning because that has other connotations in American politics, but at 1 in the morning, and you ask Saeb, tell me, what are the goals of the peace process? He'll say, Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital. And you wake up most Israeli negotiators at 1 in the morning and ask the same identical question. And the answer you're probably going to get is, and then you might get as an answer, peace, or peace with security, which are all worthy goals. But you characterize for me the difference between somebody who says the goal is a Palestinian state with Jerusalem as its capital, and somebody else who says the goal is peace or peace with security. The difference is the first guy has a defined goal, and the second has an abstract goal. Now, I don't care whether you're practicing law, business, academia, whatever your field is. Anybody who has a defined goal in a negotiation wins. That's just the way it is. And I've strongly believed, people always ask me, you know, Israel's Hasbara, how do you improve it? You know what we need? We need a message. It's not just messengers. We need a message, defined goals. So that line of thought brought me into the following set of conclusions. I noticed that when Israel announced its settlement freeze at the end of last year, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton issued a very carefully drafted statement that I want to read to you. The statement was, we put it on the back of this booklet, she wrote as follows, it's possible to reconcile the Palestinian goal of an independent and viable state on the 1967 lines with agreed land swaps, and the Israeli goal of a Jewish state with secure recognized borders that reflect subsequent developments and meet Israeli security requirements. I have no critique of the Secretary of State. I think she's trying here to be balanced in her approach and fulfilling the American role in trying to bring the parties together. But if you look at this statement, again, you have this same fundamental problem. The Palestinian position is based on the 1967 lines. It is well defined. You could take out a pen and draw a map based on the description of the Palestinian position. The Israeli position, it ends with a really good idea that the final result should meet Israeli security requirements. Guess what? Except if you serve in the National Security Council of either the administration or the Israeli government, you don't know what Israel's security requirements are. You can't even turn this sentence into something sensible. And that's why, as the head of the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, I decided that this book would be vital. We brought together the 5 of, I think, Israel's best military minds, and then Dan Diker and I both joined in and brought in the political diplomatic analysis. And we have covered what are those Israeli security requirements. Now, running through the book, as you look at it, you're going to find that although these are separate people and everyone has their independent views and they might vote differently in elections, and I have no idea how they vote, but regardless of the fact they have different positions, there are 3 common themes that keep surfacing in all the chapters. Number 1, Israel cannot withdraw to the 1967 lines, which are more properly called the 1949 armistice lines. People who say 1967 border are simply using an incorrect term. These are armistice lines. These are military lines where the army stopped in 1948, where there were some quick little exchanges between the Jordanians and Israel, and that's in the last year of the war. So number one, Israel cannot return to the 49 armistice lines. Number two, Israel will need defensible borders. We don't have a map here. We don't tell you where the lines will be drawn for defensible borders. That'll be in negotiations. But Israel has a concept of defensible borders. It's had one since the time of Yitzhak Rabin and Yigal Allon, and that's amplified in the book. And the requirement of defensible borders also includes something that 99% of observers of the Middle East do not know, that Israel cannot concede control over a unified airspace over the West Bank, that it is impossible to provide for the air defense of Israel if Israel simply says, we're out of the airspace. It's now Palestinian airspace. The man who writes about this in this book, his name is General Udi Dekel. Udi Dekel was chief negotiator for Tzipi Livni under the previous Olmert government. He's a brigadier general in the Israeli Air Force, was. He's now in reserves. And the third point, which runs through the whole book, that I want all of you to be aware of, is that we consider the option of putting international forces in the West Bank instead of Israel. We look at UN forces. We look at NATO forces, since that idea has been surfacing here and there. And there is a clear conclusion running through all the chapters, that only Israel can defend itself by itself, and Israel should not rely on international forces instead of its own military presence. In fact, there's a very incisive issue which is considered here about NATO that most people don't know. That NATO puts all kinds of stipulations on the deployments of its national forces in places like Afghanistan, so that German forces in Afghanistan will not go into certain combat areas, or won't fight at night, or won't be near poppy fields. And these stipulations that limit NATO's use in Afghanistan could be relevant in a peacekeeping mission here too, and that's one of the reasons we also question the whole idea of putting NATO forces in the West Bank. In any event, I'm going to leave enough time for questions. I just want to make one last point. The ideas that we're putting forward in this book have been part of a U.S.-Israeli discussion for many years and recognized. If we gave a quiz to the editorial board of the New York Times, I'm not sure they would know that UN Security Council Resolution 242, adopted in November of 1967, did not require Israel to return to the 1949 armistice lines. That there was a huge negotiation between President Johnson and Prime Minister Kosygin over the definite article in 242, withdrawal from the territories versus withdrawal from territories, which appears, of course, in the actual resolution. And more recently, I'm not going through the whole history, we have the case of the letter written by President George W. Bush to Ariel Sharon on April 14th, 2004. When I mentioned that letter to several of my Israeli colleagues, they said, but that was Bush. President Obama is now president. Well, it turns out the Bush letter, which says that Israel will not return to the 49 armistice lines, which says Israel has a right to defensible borders, that letter was supported by both houses of the U.S. Congress, by the U.S. Senate and the U.S. House of Representatives in June 2004. And just out of curiosity, I went into that website known as Thomas, where you can see who voted how. And back in 2004, in the U.S. Senate, Senator Hillary Clinton of New York voted for the Bush letter. And in the House of Representatives, Representative Rahm Emanuel voted for the Bush letter. President Obama was not in the U.S. Congress at the time. My point is that the Bush letter is part of the legacy of negotiations, and it became a bipartisan letter in June 2004. So we are speaking about ideas that are at the center of Israeli strategic thinking, that are at the center of how, I would say, many Israeli military thinkers think about how to defend Israel in the future. And when we talk about Israeli security requirements, either in proximity talks or direct talks that we'll have in the future, we must keep the chapters of this book in mind.
You know, ladies and gentlemen, there are people that will listen to this discussion today and will read the book, heard what Ambassador Gold has said and what General Diana said, and said, are you guys kidding me? I mean, are you guys really serious? We were almost there. We were at Camp David, we were at Annapolis, and we were in the final, we almost reached an agreement. So what are you guys talking about now, going back to the original principles of defensible borders and electromagnetic security and no foreign forces in West Bank, Judea, and Samaria? And, you know, the answer is that what we've tried to do here in this book is to go back to basics. And I would say, if there was a headline, is to return to the security first peace policy of Yitzhak Rabin, of blessed memory. The Israeli people want security first. The Israeli people, as everyone in this room knows, have been through the opposite notion, particularly since Camp David collapsed, the Al-Aqsa War of Terror was launched, the Gaza disengagement occurred, that was followed by another war of rocket terror. The Israeli people want security first, not diplomacy first. And that is what this book and this concept is, a return to security first. That had been the school of thought of Israeli government since 1967, from Levi Eshkol to Golda, to Rabin in his first administration, to Sharon, to Prime Minister Netanyahu in his first administration. As a matter of fact, when Dr. Gold was foreign policy advisor to Prime Minister Netanyahu in 1996, in 1997, the Prime Minister at that time talked about the Alon Plus plan. Of course, General Yigal Allon was the pre-state Palmach commander. He was Rabin's commander and then served as Rabin's foreign minister in 1976. When Yigal Allon wrote that extraordinary article in Foreign Affairs magazine, which was laid out the principles of defensible borders, which is what we're talking about today. There is a strategic, security-driven, peace-aspiring through line for the last 40 years of Israeli diplomacy. And those are the principles of what we're talking about. Now, those people that say, but you guys are not serious because we were almost there, they are talking about a gap. We have a problem. There is a major gap between the way many in the international community view the peace process and the way the Israeli public views the quest for peace today. Israeli public security first, and many, if not most in the international community, are no, diplomacy first. That peace agreements is the guarantor of Israel's security. Not that, as this book claims, and as we are saying here today, that diplomacy is an extension of the security red lines that are determined up front. And it is that Israeli governments demanded since 1967. So we were really returning to the security first peace policy of former Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. There has been some confusion created out there in the world because the opposite notion, meaning diplomacy-based security, the opposite notion of security-based diplomacy, had actually commanded our attention and had been the guiding principle over the last 10 years. We saw it at Camp David when former Prime Minister Barak, in his desperation for an agreement, or in his urgency for agreement, better word, pushed Camp David to see if Arafat was serious or to unmask him. Well, he was unmasked, but then again, that notion continued that diplomacy and peace agreements would be the guarantor of Israel's security. We saw it in a unilateral sense when Prime Minister Sharon, even though he was very tough on the issue of defensible borders in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, got out of Gaza in the hope of creating the possibility for a Palestinian nation state in Gaza first. That didn't work out, as we know, and then again in Annapolis. So the expectation in the international community is that Israel would continue in this school of thought called diplomacy-driven security, and not the opposite is what we are talking about today. And it is that gap, the high expectation of the type of concessions that Israel should advance, as opposed to where the Israeli public is today, which is security first, diplomacy second, is the gap or the void into which this book falls. Now, one final word about context. we know that Chairman Abbas was here, speaking to Jewish leadership, speaking to the administration, and there is something that is little known in terms of context, and I do spend a lot of time in Ramallah with some of these people, with some of the leaders, and what has become clear to us in Israel is that the Palestinian Authority is no longer negotiating with the State of Israel. The Palestinian Authority is negotiating with the government of the United States and with the Europeans, and they are pursuing a unilateral strategy to statehood. There is a difference between the way Prime Minister Fayyad is approaching it and the way Chairman Abbas is approaching it. Chairman Abbas is not in favor of a unilateral declaration. He is in favor of coalescing the international community and bringing a Security Council resolution that will propose the establishment of the State of Palestine on the 1949 armistice lines with Jerusalem as its capital. Prime Minister Fayyad, on the other hand, is pursuing what can be called the Kosovo strategy. And in fact, if you go to Google, you can find statements by senior advisors such as Yasser Abed-Rabo about the fact that the Palestinians are pursuing, and have been since 2008, the Kosovo strategy, which essentially tries to replicate in image, if not in fact, the unilateral statehood declaration that the majority Muslim Kosovar government made from its Serbian Christian parent in February of 2008. And the Palestinians see that as their model. And they are not interested in negotiating with us, and that is why this book is important, because their bottom line, their red line, with no flexibility, are the 1949 armistice lines, and they have support in this country, and they have support in other countries for that. And so it's important, as Dore started his talk, in creating symmetry of claims, so they understand what our claims are and we understand what their claims are. And it's particularly important now in the security environment that we find ourselves in, opposite the Palestinians, who are no longer negotiating with us, and of course Hamas, who have become empowered and strengthened by the recent events, and who are will make a play to become the new leaders of the PLO as we move forward. And therefore, we're in a security environment in which defensible borders and the other security guarantees that Prime Minister Netanyahu talked about exactly a year ago today at the Bar Ilan speech, when he said a demilitarized Palestinian state would be acceptable to Israel if all of these security guarantees will be met. And that is where the Israeli public is today, and those are the principles of this book, Security First Diplomacy, and we are returning again to the Security First peace policies of Yigal Allon and Yitzhak Rabin. Thank you.
Let me lay out this Kosovo strategy a little bit with a little greater detail and see what we have to do about it. The Palestinian leadership is very smart. They know that a unilateral declaration of a Palestinian state is a fundamental breach of the Oslo agreements. That's just tearing them up and basically going back to 1992. So they have a method that they have in mind, and the original, I would say, author of this method is the former foreign policy czar of the European Union, Solana, who gave a speech in London back about a year or two ago, in which he put forward this scenario. The European Union would put into the Security Council a proposal that the member states of the United Nations recognize the state of Palestine. So it's not that the Palestinians are doing it, the European Union is doing it through the Security Council. You know, the United Nations doesn't recognize countries. You can become a member of the UN, but it can make a recommendation that countries act bilaterally towards a new state and recommend that they recognize them, don't recognize them, etc. This is the likely mechanism we're going to face. Now, most Israelis realize that they're going to part from some of the territories in the West Bank. But the big issue is really over what are the future borders. And if this unilateral method, using the Security Council, strips Israel of Jerusalem and defensible borders, and establishes the 49 armistice lines, which are sometimes called the 67 lines, as the borders of the new Palestinian state, that is something Israel will have to oppose. Now, we have these past American guarantees, like the Bush letter, and there are others. And the question is, what does the administration do under such circumstances? Let's say the European Union puts up this vote in the Security Council. If the administration simply tells Ambassador Rice to abstain and there's no U.S. veto, then we have a dynamic created which is extremely dangerous. You have to understand, no responsible Israeli government can sign off on the 49 armistice lines. That's what this book is saying. No Israeli government can sign off on something in which the airspace over the West Bank is now foreign airspace. It cannot be agreed to. No former commander of the Israeli Air Force will agree to it. And therefore, it's important for us to sensitize our friends in the United States, but we'll also go to Europe and UK, et cetera, to these security needs. So they'll understand what's our problem if this dynamic is unleashed. Now, I think you asked about how do we get the parties to negotiate again? Well, if Mahmoud Abbas and Salam Fayyad see that things are moving in this direction and they're about to get the 49 armistice lines on a silver platter, why should they negotiate? And that is probably why, in the last year, what we have are Palestinian preconditions for negotiations that didn't exist before. I negotiated with Arafat, with Abu Mazen, and we had construction going on in Israeli settlements. We had construction going on also in Palestinian villages. Big deal. Concrete wasn't going to determine the borders. But now with preconditions like the question of settlement construction, this makes it much harder to get to negotiations. Extending this whole issue into Jerusalem. The Oslo Accords never gave the Palestinians jurisdiction in Jerusalem. It's clarified that Israel has jurisdiction in this interim arrangement until we have to finish the final status talks. So I think as long as they're putting up preconditions into negotiations, and as long as they are locked onto what Dan Diker has called the Kosovo option, it's going to be very hard to get a meaningful negotiation started. They have to be firmly disabused of this idea, or we're going to be sending the Israeli-Palestinian relationship into much greater chaos than you can imagine.
Anybody else want to comment?
The major precondition, just following what Dore said, that I neglected to mention in the talk was that in late December 2009, Mahmoud Abbas said that the precondition for negotiations in the proximity talks would be an international recognition of the what they call the 1967 lines as a precondition to negotiations. That was overlooked by many in the international media. It was overlooked in the international media, but that was the clearest indication, only 5 months ago, that the Palestinians really were not interested in negotiating, in addition to the responses that they gave. The current Israeli government, frankly, factually speaking, has gone further in terms of concessions and gestures than any Israeli government since 1967. The moratorium that is currently in place east of the 1949 armistice lines is the most far-reaching moratorium that Israel has ever seen, and it has been wholly rejected as not serious by the Palestinian side. So their behavior indicates that very clearly, example after example, that they are not negotiating, in addition to which we have heard firsthand from people on the Palestinian side in places of responsibility, authority, and leadership that the word Kosovo option strategy comes up again and again, and has in the last 8 months.
There are maybe 4 or 5 people on this planet who really believe that if we'll return to sit down with the Palestinians now and try a little bit harder, we'll end by a full peace agreement with the Palestinians. The practical problem is that out of those 4 or 5 people, 3 of those people are living in the White House. So Israel should be very careful here. We don't want to lose hope. We have to come with a positive strategy, policy. We want to keep as good relations with our big strategic partner, the United States of America, and try to come with a positive approach to it, because we can't just go back and say, okay, we don't want to talk. We do want to talk. But we have our lines and our points and our issue, and one of them is defensible border. It's a very good point, because we're entitled to it. It's recognized. So let's talk about it. Now, some people might come and say, but the Palestinians won't agree to it. First of all, I don't see that they agree to other points. And two, they will have to agree to it because it's truly our need. We have to continue with an open approach. We want to talk to the Palestinians, we want to talk directly with the Palestinians, and hope for better days, but in the same time insist on our vital issues like defensible borders. What will be the end of it or the bottom line? If I'm wrong, a peace agreement. If not, at least what can be achieved from it, it's a interim agreement with a better position to build a lasting peace some day in the future, and or to bring the Jordanians as a partner to this equation.
Former Representative Wexler, I'd like to share with you some of the profound concerns that the Israeli public is feeling at this time about its greatest friend in the world, the United States. When the Israeli public sees, in August 2009, at the Fatah 6th Congress in Bethlehem, which the Israeli Defense Forces enabled, the Fatah assert publicly, on the record, that their strategic choice is the destruction of the state of Israel by armed means. Israelis say, where is our friend, the United States? Why aren't they saying something about that? You know, when the Israeli public sees the Palestinian Authority leadership run to the UN Human Rights Council after begging Israel to finish off Hamas in Gaza in Operation Cast Lead, and petition the UN Human Rights Council to trigger the Goldstone Commission report, Israelis say, how could the United States let that happen? Our best friend. And when Foreign Minister Riyad al-Malki and Justice Minister Ali Kashan, on the instructions of Mr. Fayyad, go to the International Criminal Court and petition against the State of Israel after fighting for the PA in Gaza, and they petition against us on charges of crimes against humanity, genocide, and war crimes. The Israeli public is saying, where is our greatest friend in the world, the United States of America? And I just choose those three examples because the Israeli public is crying, is vulnerable, is concerned, and they really, truly love this country. And they want this country next to them as we go through a very difficult, dangerous period with Hezbollah to our north, Syria, Turkey with a major question mark, and Hamas to our south, all being manipulated by the Islamic Republic of Iran's leadership. The Israeli people want the United States next to them, they want defensible borders, and they are hoping and praying that our greatest friend is with us on these issues. Thank you.
Look, right now, we have a problem of Palestinian obstructionism. And I laid it out to you. They have no interest in engaging us. And, you know, I'm even aware of some of the back channel stuff that's been going on. They are holding out for getting the prize on a silver platter. Now, why then talk about this? Well, of course, there are two scenarios ahead where this is extremely relevant. What if the Palestinians turn to the United States and say, you know, if you put a proposal out and you give us a heads up on what's in it, we'll agree to it. But you've got to put the proposal out. And that proposal strips us of our needs. That's one scenario. I'm less concerned with an Obama plan coming out tomorrow, but nonetheless, it's a possible scenario. And then you have to know, what does Israel need? If Israel hasn't spoken up, if you don't know the security requirements that Hillary Clinton related to, you got to know them. That's why they're here. And the second scenario, of course, are these unilateral scenarios in the Security Council? The Kosovo plan. You know, why should the United States veto a European-led initiative to establish the 49 armistice line as the permanent border of Israel and the border of the Palestinian state? Well, here are the reasons. So if you don't have, let's say, in the community of people who are concerned about Israel, an awareness of these security needs, then how are you going to deal with these likely scenarios in the future, regardless of whether the Palestinians come to sincerely negotiate or not? Maybe we have a small chance. Maybe at the last minute, Mahmoud Abbas go, you know what, I should really sit down with Bibi and negotiate this. And I think, by the way, he is sincere, and he is willing to make peace with the Palestinians. But he knows what the people of Israel have gone through. He knows that they were promised a final peace, that the Oslo agreements would lead to something better. We had over 1,000 Israelis killed in suicide bombing attacks that came from areas under Arafat's jurisdiction. And everybody knows what happened with disengagement. We thought disengagement was going to lead to the beginnings of a Palestinian state in Gaza with all that British gas offshore and agribusiness in the north. And what did it lead to? A 500% increase in rocket fire on Israel. So if we go down this path again, and I know the Prime Minister's been trying to do it, he has to make certain that he's not going to experiment with the lives of Israelis, and that they will know that they will be more secure as a result of peace rather than less secure.
Lizzie? All right,
Just one quick, just a half a sentence about demography. Look, there is still this argument out there about defensible borders and its relationship to the demographic, what is called the demographic problem in the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. And there are numbers that are thrown around that Israel will be less than a majority between the river and the sea. Ladies and gentlemen, why did we go to Oslo? We went to Oslo to end, once and for all, the claim that there is a demographic problem. Once the territories were divided by agreement into areas A, B, and C, there is no longer a demographic problem because Israel makes no claim to annexation of all of Judea and Samaria by agreement. So the issue that remains is an issue of borders. It's an issue that is open to, that requires mutual agreement by the sides, and nothing short of that. So the notion that Israel, which by the way does not control, the Palestinian Authority controls between 95 and 98% of the lives of all Palestinians in the West Bank on an administrative, civil basis. And now they control about 17 or 18% with the Dayton forces in Area A. We have a disagreement about where those borders are going to be drawn, but there is no demographic issue. That is why the Oslo Accords were signed, and that ended the demographic issue. So to now bring it back into the discussion is simply inaccurate and does not reflect either the spirit or the letter of what those agreements were about.
The border with Egypt is a good example for a defensible border. We did evacuate it, we left Sinai for a peace agreement. It does all, but the reason is so because Sinai is demilitarized. We have our troops, we have enough distance, we have enough strategic depth, and I can assure you that if we agreed that the Egyptian troops will be on the Israeli-Egyptian border today, this peace agreement wouldn't last for a long time. The reason that there is a good, let's say, defensible and a military agreement there, and there is enough area, made my point. Sinai is demilitarized. I want the Palestinian cities, the Palestinian areas in the Judah and Samaria to be demilitarized.
Just as Mahmoud Abbas has a right to come forward and say he wants a viable, contiguous Palestinian state that provides Israel with security, but nothing that impinges on his sovereignty, we have a right, because don't forget, both he and us are before negotiations. We have a right to lay out what our needs are. And the biggest mistake we can make, and we always make it, is to start shaving off our positions before we even get to negotiations. And I would never suggest that an Israeli government starts saying, well, you know what, all right, we'll take a mixed Israeli-NATO force, you know, when you're briefing the New York Times, because it sounds good. I strongly believe that the principle of self-reliance of the State of Israel is vital in its security. And we can have good friends like the United States, and we have U.S. providing us with certain aspects of our security that we can't provide for ourselves. For example, the special radar that picks up Iranian missiles coming from a long distance, which is manned by U.S. troops. But in terms of the ultimate security of Israel, if we start putting in, for example, U.S. forces in the Jordan Valley, we're going to change the equation of our relationship. We will have a situation in which many in America will see us, they already know we're dependent on you in the United States for security assistance. What if they also knew that American boys are going to die in the defense of Israel? Which is what they would begin to talk about. And we don't want to go there. We don't want to go down that road. You deployed American troops in Korea, fine. You deployed American troops in Germany and NATO, fine. We do have a security assistance program, and we are grateful for it. We are grateful for the help of the United States in developing the Arrow anti-missile system. But we don't want to go that extra step. And I think that's one of the reasons why it's absolutely vital that only Israel defends itself by itself.
We would be pleased to send a complimentary DVD of this program to anyone who can send a tax-deductible contribution of $36 or more to the nonprofit organization Jewish Education in Media to help support our programming. Tax-deductible checks may be made out to GEM and mailed to GEM, Post Office Box 180, Riverdale Station, Bronx, New York, 10471. Please indicate the program for which you would like a DVD, and we thank you for your kind support.